Okay, so today's topic is going to be a bit spicy. I have a lot of personal thoughts about this topic that I really feel need to be brought forth. Don't worry, I'm not making this video out of malice. This isn't a hit piece or anything like that. I'm not looking to trash on Spider-Man and say he's weird entirely, although Marvel has been making him really weird in the comics lately, but that's not the topic of this video. The topic of this video is about me addressing some of the preconceived standards about said character that I find to be rather weird. And this won't just apply to Spider-Man. I plan on doing this with a lot of comic book IPs that come to mind. I know that I'm probably not going to be the first to do this, but I feel pretty confident about it, and that's good enough. When people talk about Spider-Man conventionally online, they often bring up all these preconceived standards about said character that are usually educational, but for the most part are incredibly vague, and overrated as fuck, if I might add. Such as people saying that Spider-Man doesn't shoot his own webs, he uses web shooters. Now, as much as I like Stan Lee and respect what he has accomplished in the comic book industry, this is actually one of those original comic book concepts that I've never been a fan of, because it doesn't really live by the name Spider-Man. Yes, Peter Parker is a genius, but as was shown in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, Peter Parker's genius can actually be portrayed in more meaningful ways, such as him graduating high school and majoring in science. Not to mention doing a full scientific report on biology. If that doesn't scream genius, I don't know what does. The idea of Spider-Man should really be that he is a superhero with the abilities of a spider. Sure, the mechanical web shooters may have been a concept Stan Lee created in the comics to show off the capabilities of Peter as a superhero in his own right. But naturally, if a person were to get bitten by a radioactive spider in real life, they would get all 5 abilities. They wouldn't just get 4. Because that wouldn't really make sense from a biological standpoint. Now, if you were to tell me that Peter's genius is too powerful for a spider to match, or that the spider's DNA enhanced his genius when it bit him, then sure, I suppose him having mechanical web shooters would make sense. But from a realistic standpoint, it does not. Besides, if we're going to be running with the narrative that Peter Parker is too smart to have all the abilities of a spider, then he might as well have never ended up with a symbiote. Which brings me over to my next point about Spider-Man being weird, and that is people saying that the symbiote naturally has no effect on Peter. Which is ridiculous, because what's the point of Peter even having the symbiote if it can't do anything to him? Sure, you could say that it was just confused and that it was living with Peter as a parasite to survive, but that's not enough to really justify him even having it in the first place, especially as a storytelling narrative. Now, the story behind this is interesting. Apparently, at the time when Todd McFarlane was writing and illustrating Spider-Man, Marvel wanted Peter to don a new suit because, I don't know, I guess maybe they got sick and tired of seeing him rock out the classic red and blue suit in every issue. But Todd loved Peter's original suit. As a matter of fact, he loved it so much that he didn't ever want to see Peter fully digit. So he brought the black suit into Spider-Man comics as an alien parasite looking for the perfect host to survive. This would then evolve into what we now know as Venom, which ended up being the biggest influence for Todd's creation of Spawn over at Image Comics. And as we all know, Venom was introduced in Spider-Man 3. Now, a lot of Spider-Man fans didn't like how Venom was portrayed in that movie, with him fundamentally changing Peter Parker by just having him be an utter jackass towards MJ, Harry, and everyone he normally interacts with on good terms. And this is because Sam Raimi had no real interest in portraying Venom in his movies. He originally intended for Spider-Man 3 to just be about Peter's feud with Harry, where Sandman is introduced as a tragic villain, a movie that I really wish we could have gotten in the editor's cut. But of course, Sony forced Raimi to include Venom in the third film because apparently Venom was already a successful character by the time of Spider-Man 3. So Sam Raimi, the director of Spider-Man, relented to that idea and gave us Venom in Spider-Man 3. And you know what? As a Spider-Man fan myself, I was actually one of the people who really loved how Venom was portrayed in Spider-Man 3. Specifically Peter's Venom. Eddie Brock's Venom was average at best, but that's an entirely different video on its own. Peter's Venom, to me, was the highlight of Spider-Man 3 for 2 reasons. One, because the symbiote actually makes Tobey's Spider-Man suit look a lot more interesting in CGI shots. And two, because the symbiote actually serves as a great motivator for Peter to make better decisions and to be a better person. One of the things I've always loved about Raimi's approach to Spider-Man was his Peter Parker and how pure-hearted he was. Seeing Peter go from being a wallflower dorky kid to an inspiring figure for all is one of the most iconic ways to portray Spider-Man on screen. The wallflower dorky aspect of Peter that Raimi portrays on screen is so on point with what makes Spider-Man such a great hero. Because that's what he is in concept. He's a hero for the people, much like Superman. And so having him go through an arc where he's having personality issues with an alien parasite is truly amazing. It may not be on point with what Venom Spider-Man is actually like in the comics, but I don't think it really needs to be. Especially given the fact that the idea of Venom literally came from a guy who wanted to make Spider-Man look cool. Plus, let's not forget that at the end of the day, aliens naturally are genetically enhanced beings that come from a world of Deus Ex Machina, where anything's possible. And this Venom symbiote is no different from that, so who are we to really say what they can and cannot do? Personally, I really like the idea of Peter giving up the Venom symbiote by way of circumstance instead of by way of choice, because that motivates him to strive for greater success as a hero and as a person. It also pushes him to truly live by the moral values of his uncle. And the next thing I find weird about comic book Spider-Man is Uncle Ben. Apparently it's been said that Uncle Ben's line, "with great power comes great responsibility," didn't really come from him. It came from the narrator. A guy on YouTube who goes by the name Spiderdunk had mentioned this in his "What Spider-Man Fans Get Wrong About Spider-Man" video, which at first glance seems like a pretty interesting fact to bring up, but then he goes on this tirade saying that it wouldn't have made sense for Uncle Ben to tell Peter, "with great power comes great responsibility." And on top of that, he brings up some ridiculous narrative for why he thinks it wouldn't have made sense for Uncle Ben to say that. And immediately right off the bat I'm thinking, okay, this guy is certifiably insane, because first of all, you're generalizing. Uncle Ben is not telling Peter how to be Spider-Man when he tells him with great power comes great responsibility. He's telling him to be smart about his choice to defend himself out in public. Because in the real world, people would get arrested for defending themselves at the level Peter did. Besides, if Uncle Ben really were to give Peter Parker Spider-Man advice, I would imagine it likely would have been something more noble than "with great power comes great responsibility." And second of all, I highly doubt that Sam Raimi and Mark Webb were thinking of black empowerment when they gave the responsibility line over to Uncle Ben. I'm not even going to bring up John Watts, because his take on Spider-Man made absolutely no sense, along with his take on Aunt May. Plus, Uncle Ben isn't even featured in his own version of Spider-Man, so there's that. But when Raimi and Webb gave the responsibility line over to Uncle Ben, they were probably thinking of that as being a legitimate fatherly line, which is really what any legal guardian, male legal guardian that is, would likely say to a kid if you really think about it in literal terms. Not to mention, there's always the thought that maybe Uncle Ben was never really given a chance to shine as much as Peter in the original Spider-Man comics. I'm not saying that's true, just something to consider. Anyway, the next thing I find weird about comic book Spider-Man is evil Peter Parker. One of the most common criticisms that I often always hear all the time about Raimi's Peter Parker is that he is too dorky to be considered Peter Parker. Because Peter Parker in the original Spider-Man comics was just always portrayed as someone who was assertive and always fought back against his bullies. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear about this is, okay, so Stan Lee basically had written this guy to be like Daniel LaRusso from the Karate Kid franchise. If you've watched the Karate Kid films, specifically the first one, you would know that Daniel LaRusso was an angsty teenager who had been relatable and had always fought against his bullies, because he grew up poor and had a rough upbringing. And like Peter, he had an old wise man by his side to teach him how to be a better man. Though LaRusso's arc in the first Karate Kid film would be more about him becoming a better fighter. The problem I have with a Spider-Man that goes through this kind of arc is that it doesn't really match up well with the friendly neighborhood aspect of the character. Like, if he's just a guy who's always had anger issues and has always been driven by resentment, then why should we really look at him as a hero? I'm not saying that Spider-Man can't have these traits at all, but him having these traits does kind of make him feel more like Batman than Spider-Man. I don't know about you, but I personally have always looked at Spider-Man as being more of an inspiring hero than a relatable one. Because Peter Parker is a nerd. And what are the common traits of a nerd? They're awkward, naive, and unsure of themselves. Is this really the guy who you would imagine going one-on-one with Flash Thompson 24/7 whenever he feels like it? I don't think so. And on top of that, 99% of Peter's take on Spider-Man has always been centered around him being a positive role model. I feel like him being cool and relatable is something that Stan Lee and Marvel added on to the character to have him be more accessible to people. But the character of Spider-Man has always been a positive figure. Why do you think the character has been marketed as a global icon in the media for so long? It's not because he's cool. It's because he's the kind of superhero that everybody wants to be. Yes, Peter Parker is a relatable character, but Peter's relatability isn't really what defines his personality. A guy with anger issues isn't really the best way to adapt Spider-Man on screen. Spider-Man isn't Batman. He doesn't really need to be taught how to control his anger, but rather how to rise above it. Because holding on to anger only damages you more than those you hold anger towards. Spider-Man learning how to be a better fighter is something that would be more appropriate for characters like Ben Reilly or Miles Morales. Especially Miles, considering that he's always been shown to be the more relatable Spider-Man compared to Peter. Peter has always been the more inspirational Spider-Man. It's like with the Flash family. Who do you really think of as the inspirational hero? Barry Allen. Of course, you could say Jay Garrick, but he's always been more of the fatherly type. You can't really look at Wally West and Bart Allen as being inspiring heroes because obviously those characters have always been portrayed as being more relatable than Barry. But anyway, I'm getting too far off topic. Now don't get me wrong, I am in no way saying that Peter's Spider-Man should be perfect. Obviously he shouldn't. He should always have flaws, but I don't think he should really have as many flaws as Miles or any other character with Batman levels of depth. To me, the key characteristics of what makes Peter Parker special are more compelling than the characteristics of a Peter Parker driven by anger. It's the reason why I'm still to this day not a fan of the Spider-Man movies with Andrew Garfield, because they don't really do a good job of portraying the amazing qualities of Peter Parker on screen. Which I know a lot of people are likely going to disagree with me on, since the perception of those movies has been shifted over to the positive side lately. But to me, those movies make Peter Parker look and feel more like a default Ben Reilly than Peter Parker. I mean, this guy is Marvel's most popular character for a reason. It's not just because he's relatable, it's also because he's a symbol of greatness. Besides, it's better to have Peter be more altruistic than relatable, otherwise you run the risk of creating a multiverse situation like Across the Spider-Verse. Because of that, I still to this day consider Tobey Maguire excellent casting for Spider-Man on screen. Tom Holland has potential, but I need to see him in a solid trilogy of Spider-Man films before coming to that conclusion. Anyway, the next thing I find weird about comic book Spider-Man is his age and high school status. Now, this writing concept actually falls into the category of objectively weird things about Spider-Man, because Marvel, for whatever reason, just doesn't seem to believe in the idea of having this character move forward in any way. So much that it literally took Jonathan Hickman revitalizing the Ultimate Marvel Universe with the Maker to give us the Peter Parker we've been longing for. Because the problem with Brian Michael Bendis' take on Spider-Man in the original Ultimate Marvel Universe was that he made Peter Parker a high schooler and borrowed a lot of things from the original Marvel Universe, which started off great, but got stale as it went on. Bendis put the teenage Spider-Man spotlight on Peter Parker when it really should have gone over to Miles Morales. I still maintain that Miles Morales should have been the Spider-Man of the Ultimate Marvel Universe. The whole purpose of the Ultimate Marvel Universe was that it was supposed to be a modern spin on the original Marvel Universe. But instead, Bendis chose to go back in time with Spider-Man, and it did not help him in the long run. Which further proves my point about why Peter Parker should be more of an altruistic Spider-Man than a relatable one. But in regards to his age, I think more and more Spider-Man adaptations need to start having Peter Parker look mature. This is a character we've known since the 60s for crying out loud, and yet we're still having him look like a teenage boy in modern adaptations. Come on now! That whole teenage boy look may have worked in the Lee and Ditko Spider-Man comics, but that actually took place during his origin, when he was just starting out in the role. So of course having Peter look boyish in that adaptation is acceptable. But having him still look boyish at the age of 28 in modern Spider-Man adaptations is not acceptable. Because the whole idea of Spider-Man should be that this is a guy growing up with the times and becoming one with the world around him. Now, of course, I can understand the temptation of having him look boyish in modern adaptations because of his origin being placed in the same story as him growing up. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man films did exactly that, and it paid off amazingly, because it took a lot of inspiration from the Lee and Ditko Spider-Man comics, in which Raimi himself even made it abundantly clear that he was an absolute fan of. The Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon did exactly the same thing, despite being somewhat original down the line, with its distinct style and unique take on some of Peter's most prominent villains. So Peter being boyish in those adaptations work. But having him be that way in adaptations like the MCU films and the Insomniac games, where he's already Spider-Man, does not work. Because by that point in his life, Peter should have a distinguished look. And this is something that the first Insomniac game got right with Peter. But then they squandered that in the later games when they replaced the original acting model with a guy who looks absolutely nothing like Yuri Lowenthal. Story has it that the game developers at Insomniac didn't think that John Budiniak, the original acting model, resembled Lowenthal's voice when he played Peter Parker on screen. Yet instead, let's just go ahead and make him look like fucking Ben Tennyson on screen. And funny enough, the current on-screen actor actually happens to share the same exact first name as the beloved cartoon character. So there's that for you. But seriously, this was a devastating blow to the franchise, because this was supposed to be an alternative to what we were getting from the MCU with Tom Holland's take on Spider-Man. And now that alternative has been crushed by an out-of-nowhere foolish corporate decision. One I don't think they'll ever recover from, unless they were to actually play the face change up as a multiverse storyline in the later games, where John Budiniak's Peter Parker still exists, but got himself into a scuffle with an alternate universe chameleon, who stole his persona, and Ben Jordan's Peter is secretly the chameleon in disguise. That could actually work as a more effective and engaging story for the third game, but knowing how corporate Insomniac has gotten with their game development, I don't think they'll do that, because they seem to be too invested in what's essential for the franchise instead of what works. It's the same shit with the MCU. And in addition to that, the MCU movies have completely butchered the shit out of Peter Parker by not only having him still be 15 years old while already being Spider-Man, but also joining the Avengers and then going on to be the next Iron Man, which just further spat in the face of every Spider-Man fan. And of course now they're finally having Tom Holland's Peter grow up and go on to be his own hero in the later MCU movies. But as of now, we really only have No Way Home to thank for that. So it's a wait and see scenario. Anyway, the next objectively weird thing about Spider-Man I want to talk about is his luck. This is another objective flaw with Spider-Man that I think needs to be addressed in future adaptations, and is something I hope the future MCU movies addresses with the character going forward. Because this idea of just having Peter Parker be poor and down on his luck all the time is really getting stale, and is actually one of the things I feel is holding him back from reaching his potential as Spider-Man. And the next and final weird thing about comic book Spider-Man I want to talk about is his relationships. I don't know why Marvel is so obsessed with distancing Peter Parker from Mary Jane by having the two of them date random people, but it really needs to stop. Peter and MJ are made for each other. The 60s comics, the cartoons, the movies, and the video games have all made that abundantly clear. These two should never leave each other, because their natural characteristics simply don't allow that. And I don't think it's hard to notice that. MJ came into a pivotal point of Peter's life when he needed a true romantic partner, someone he can truly relate to and absolutely share his feelings with. Peter and MJ are too good a match for them to just split, and if they were to, I would imagine their split being played up in an interesting story where they're actually given some depth and development, which is something that Marvel has been trying to do for quite some time, and it has never worked out in their favor. And this is due to them having Peter date random women in every story. Don't get me wrong, having Peter date Gwen is cool, but that only works in stories that take place in his high school years, because Gwen Stacy is essentially a side crush for Peter. Plus, they have nothing in common outside of high school. So Peter dating a random woman in that sense is acceptable. But having Peter date someone like Liz Allen, Betty Brant, and Felicia Hardy is not acceptable. Because one, Liz Allen and Betty Brant are women that Peter only knows as associates from school and work. And two, Felicia Hardy is a bad influence on Peter. Yeah, that's right, I said it. The Black Cat and Spider-Man relationship that Marvel has been pushing for years has never made sense. It never made sense in the comics, it never made sense in the cartoons, and it never made sense in the video games. And the only way it ever does make sense is whenever Peter Parker's Spider-Man has to team up with Black Cat to fulfill whatever mission that involves the two of them having to team together. Or whatever a character of a minor role like Peter Parker's son, Richard Parker, or Miles Morales runs into Black Cat. Those are the only ways that Spider-Man's interaction with Black Cat is acceptable. But for the most part, Spider-Man should never really be with Black Cat, because one is a criminal and the other is a hero that everybody looks up to. Which I wouldn't be surprised to hear the reason for that being, well, Marvel was trying to compete with DC, which would be a dumb excuse to bring up because Batman and Catwoman are actually perfect for each other. They are troubled people who came from a life of tragedy. So the two of them work in a long-term relationship. Whereas with Spider-Man, the perfect romantic partner has always been Mary Jane. Because much like Batman and Catwoman, they both have had a rough upbringing early on in their lives. However, they would go on to become role models. Peter Parker went from being a photographer to a full-time superhero, and MJ went from being an average everyday worker to a performing artist. I say performing artist because she's taken on numerous roles in the performing arts field. Because she became a supermodel in the comics, and she became an actress in the Sam Raimi films, which I just want to point out are all in the performing arts field, guys. They're literally the same career. There's no difference other than her being a reporter and a news anchor, although I wouldn't be surprised to see a future Spider-Man adaptation actually go in that direction with her character. Anyway, the point I'm trying to hammer home is that MJ is a perfect romantic partner for Peter Parker, and it's annoying how Marvel keeps writing her in a way to distance her from Peter, which, as I mentioned previously, only works one or two ways, when written accurately. You could do it here and there, but it gets tiring real fast. Because, as I said, MJ is Peter's equal. She is the inspiration for Spider-Man, kind of like how Miles Morales is the inspiration for Ultimate Spider-Man. And I know her and Peter have debated about whether or not Spider-Man should really be with her, but they squashed that and got together. So therefore, I believe that MJ, much like Peter, needs to be written better in the mainstream. Because so far, Marvel has just been all over the place with this character. And it is not looking good. Honestly, at this point, I think they should bring back the Superior Spider-Man because the way that story ended was such bullshit, and Mephisto should have never came back. But that's a topic for another day. Anyways, that's it for this one, folks. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for the support. Your support means a lot. Don't worry, I will be making more videos. Stay righteous, and I promise you I will talk to you later.